Good morning. It's really good to be with you today, even if it's remotely like this. And I'm sorry that I can't share in what I know is going to be a very exciting and I believe an important conference for you all. And I did want to say quite simply how important I think delivering good religious education in our schools is for the young people as they grow up and become citizens of our United Kingdom. I was born and brought up in London, in Essex, really, and I've been reinventing myself ever since. But my whole family, we come from the East End of London, and certainly as a child, the whole of my area was predominantly Jewish. So when I was at school, which was the local comprehensive school, I mean, there were more Jewish children in my class than there were Gentiles. And indeed, my father worked for a Jewish chain of jewellers, and my grandma worked in the cinema in Brick Lane in the East End. And in those days, it was absolutely a Jewish area. And half term and during the school holidays, I used to go and be given by the Mr. Zaidner, the confectioner, a bag of marshmallows, and I'd be put in the circle of the cinema to watch the films. So I have so many fond memories of that. But interestingly, as a child, I always knew that I wasn't Jewish. In fact, although Mum and Dad didn't go to church, they weren't church-going people, I was dispatched to Sunday school, and I'm sure it was more of a child-minding exercise than anything else. But it sort of took, and I found myself growing up within the life of the church and discovering myself and what was important to me as a young person. And I've never turned away from that course because I learnt to recognise in the face of Jesus Christ the human face of God, and that's been transformative of my life. One of the things that really took my lovely family by surprise was when I wanted to be confirmed, and in fact my atheistic dad was really concerned I was far too young to make such a commitment and tried to dissuade me. But eventually they gave in when I was 14, but they were even more shocked at the age of 15 when I announced that over supper one night that I wanted to be a priest. Mum and Dad really died on the spot. But they travelled with me, and right the way through their life they've always been supportive, even if they couldn't understand what was really driving me from within and why I wanted to do this. And I shall always be grateful for their unconditional love. Going off to university, I read theology, but later, following my ordination, I actually took a complete U-turn in my life. It wasn't a new turn because I decided to become a Benedictine monk. And for 10 years of my life, I was in a monastery. And it was a real sense of going deeper into God, deeper into prayer, and that has been transformative of my whole being. And I shall always be grateful for that because it gave me a deep rhythm within my heart that has enabled me to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. After 10 years in the monastery, I felt increasingly called to return to parish life. And it was a traumatic time because my community were really sad to see me go, and it was maybe difficult to understand. It was more difficult to leave the monastery than it was to go. But I've never regretted the decision either to go to be a monk or to leave. And I became a vicar back in London, but not in the part of London where I'd come from, but in North London. I found myself living in a very mixed, multicultural area, and it was fantastic. I loved every single minute of it. Though very early on, as vicar, we had a traumatic episode because the London bombings took place. And in particular, in the next door parish to me, of course, there was the bomb of the tube station in King's Cross. And the vicar in the next door parish to me was there on the platform dealing with people as they died. I was on duty at the Royal Free Hospital, where casualties were brought in an emergency. It was a terrible time. But also it was devastating for the local community because my Muslim neighbours, they were terrified of whether there might be vengeance upon them. And it's very difficult to communicate to you just the fear that was abroad in the community. But when you actually talked to my Muslim neighbours, actually, they're just like everybody else, because what they're really concerned about was the children and the education of their children and whether they could get, a decent job and a home. It was all the sort of things that actually any parent would want. And for me, as the local vicar, it was a privilege to draw alongside them in their own fear and the fact that they actually trusted me as a Christian. The extraordinary thing was also that there were as many synagogues as there were parish churches. So I also got to know the local rabbis very well. And one in particular, I remember walking along the road with him and he said to me, well, the trouble about you Christians, he said, you're far too polite to God. We Jews, we just say it how it is. And indeed, that's how Jews pray. And that's why I've always just had an abiding affection for Judaism and learnt with them and alongside them about my own faith and my own spiritual journey. I remember him also saying on one day that he was talking, and it was really after these bombings that he was talking, and he was saying that I think you Christians, he said, have a much stronger understanding of the compassion of God than we Jews have. He said, I think it must be something to do with the cross. And he immediately changed the subject. I think, to be honest, he was a bit embarrassed that he'd said it. But indeed, for Christians, that is exactly it. It is something to do with the cross, because when I look at Christ crucified, I find God looking back at me and looking at me with love and tenderness and compassion. And I suppose it was out of those experiences that I was invited by the Camden and Islington Health Authority to give the palliative care team help, because when people were going into designated wards which were particularly geared with palliative care, a lot of the staff were finding it very difficult. They were finding it difficult because people were coming from different places with different beliefs, and they didn't know how to look after them in the closing days and hours of their lives. Mainly, I have to say, because although they were superb doctors and nurses, they were religiously illiterate. They hadn't got a clue. I can remember in particular, there was one family of Bangladeshi origin where the poor man, as he was dying, kept getting out of bed and wanting to lie on the floor. And as fast as he was doing it, the nurses kept trying to put him back in the bed. And I had to try to explain that for this man, in his religious tradition, he knew somehow within him that he was dying and he needed to be on the ground, not in a bed, to die. So it was things like that where it just shows how religious education is really important if we're going to engender the respect, the mutual respect that actually a healthy society needs if we're going to flourish. I suppose that came home to me also in a very personal way in my own family, because not long after I became Bishop of Exeter 8 years ago, first of all, my mother had a stroke, and then my father died, and then my mum died just 5 weeks later. I mean, Mum and Dad were glued at the hip. And when Dad died, Mum, well, she turned her face to the wall. 6 months before Dad died, there was a terrible incident. He'd gone up to the post office to collect his pension, and he'd been mugged for his pension outside the post office by an unknown white male in his mid-20s. Dad was confused. Dad couldn't describe the person anymore. But after the police had come to interview my father, the extraordinary was that the doorbell went, and it was the imam on the doorstep. And he said to my dad, he said, Mr. Atwell, they knew my dad's name because he was the whole area was fundamentally that Jews had gone and they were now all Muslims in where they lived. And he introduced himself. I understand, he said, that your son is a priest. He said, well, I'm a priest too, he was explaining to Dad, and I understand that you were attacked outside the post office. So I've just come to check that you're all right, and on behalf of our community to say how sad we are, and is there any way we could help? For me, that was a deeply moving thing. And indeed, when Dad did die, the imam came to the funeral. I took my dad's funeral in the local parish church, and the imam had never been in a Christian church in his life. And there he was with, 10, 12 Muslims in the church wanting to pay respect to my dear dad. And he came to Mum's funeral too. That's just the sort of mutual respect and that actually we need in our country. And if we're going to do it, it starts right at the beginning in primary school from onwards. It's so important. Which is why I think what your task is in our schools is fundamental to the life of modern Britain today, and why I want to support you gladly and wholeheartedly. One of my sadnesses today about Britain is the way that religion has got such a negative connotation. It's freighted bad. If you're religious, you must be barking. It's always negative. It's sort of linked with fanaticism, rather than actually something which, in my experience anyway, has been life-giving. It's taught me what it means to be a human being. The thing about religion, and it was actually the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks who said this, is that the origin of the word religion is in the Latin word religio. It means to bind together. And that's what religion does. It binds us together. It certainly bound me together inside myself and stopped me falling apart in difficult times in my life. But also religion is what binds us together as a community, because faith at its best is not all about me. It's about us. It's about what we can do together. That's the important thing. It's about us. Life is more than just having a great time. And at the heart of the Christian gospel is Jesus' command to love God with our heart, soul and mind, but to love our neighbour as ourselves. It's those things that have been the formative thing in my life. And I will hope that it will be at the heart of the life of the church in this country too. Thank you for what you're doing. And I hope that your conference is really engaging and transforming for you in your work.